Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manis Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. This week, we're talking about the recent volatility in the Middle East, sort of a war that had stayed relatively cold for the better part of the last 40 years, turning hot over the last 12 days. And what this says about the metamorphosis of MAGA. Um, Brunello, we all saw sort of the would he, won't he moment, would the US intervene or not, specifically with these sort of, gigantic B-2 bombers. And turns out that did happen to strike, particularly the underground enrichment facilities at Fordo. Can you recap some of the developments of the last week and what they've brought us to?
In the previous column, we discussed about these escalating tensions in the Middle East that, of course, have culminated in the strikes of Israel against Iran. Then there was the weekend in which there was some uncertainty on whether the US will intervene, something they eventually decided to do by striking three nuclear sites, the well-known Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan. Um, these names have been circulating for as long as I can remember. Um, then the question is, um, were they effective? Clearly, at the time in which I wrote the column, we didn't know what the effectiveness was. As we are recording, instead, there are some reports by the New York Times, CNN, citing intelligence sources saying that in reality they were not as effective as they were hoping. We'll see. Clearly, they use this massive ordnance penetrator, which also, is clearly an acronym for something that is supposed to mop up all that is around, and is supposed to be a two-stage type of bomb. The first stage creates the crater on which the second stage bomb enters in depth in the ground. But the question is, how deep can it go? And so how damaging could it be for the nuclear facilities? And this actually, we don't know, because actually, here's the problem. If you go through diplomacy and you get somebody from the EIA, for example, inspecting the sites, you can have a sort of semi credible assessment, because clearly something might be hidden somewhere else, but at least you got some externalized. Now, who can actually judge the damage that was made? Certainly not the Americans or the Israelis, which are not there. Um, and so everything is left to some form of interpretation. Anyway, the strikes occurred, and then the question was, are we going to have a regime change or not? And so this is kind of the question that remained open.
And on that point of regime change, it's been floated around. It's certainly been the goal of someone like Bibi Netanyahu for decades. But the U.S. has learned some lessons. You would hope from its interventions in the Middle East in the recent past, and perhaps that's why you sort of quote this Colin Powell line: "You break it, you own it." Tell me more about what you think about the possibility of regime change in Iran. How likely is it, and what might come next if that were to happen?
So that's the point. First of all, uh, there's the internal debate, and then there's the external debate. The internal debate is, wait a minute, wasn't MAGA supposed to be an isolationist, America First movement in which we need to put an end to the stupid forever wars? These are words by Donald Trump in the Middle East, made by dumb presidents. These are the words of J.D. Vance. In the past, because if that's the case, engaging in nation building, as at some point Donald Trump seemed to entertain as an idea, it seems like a big deviation from where they were. Hence, um, the base of MAGA itself start kind of complaining Even die-hard Trumpians such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, let alone Steve Bannon, express big doubts. They say, hey, this is not what the base is for. This is what the base wants. Now, Trump claims that this is kind of sort of new Hiroshima moment in which they drop the bomb and this ends the war. It's not exactly an appropriate, I would say, comparison. The duration of the war, type of attack, who initiate, there's a whole lots of differences there. There's no even point of discussing. But the point is, can you really stop the war? Because clearly what we saw in the Iraq example is that if you really want to get rid of a regime, you need to get rid of these bosses and then do the complete cleanup. And even the cleanup is complicated because as the Americans themselves learned during the second war in Iraq was that killing the heads, wiping out the entire army, and all the bureaucrats actually create a vacuum, a chaos that you cannot easily kind of mitigate. In fact, when Iraq collapsed as a state, then ISIS came up, and then this created 20 more years of instability. So, Bush Sr. did Desert Storm, was as close as Bush Jr. to potentially killing Saddam, but then he refrained because he knew that he didn't have a solution for the day after. Bush Jr. went more or less the same way Trump went. Let's go there, let's do stuff, and we'll figure it out as we go along. Unfortunately, things don't work that way. So Trump initially said, yeah, I mean, if the regime doesn't work, what's wrong with regime change? Flagged the idea, people got really scared, and then he backtracked and said, no, we cannot do regime change, it would be chaos. And that's the real risk, that this could be a big episode of stabilization of regime rather than destabilization, because this regime survived the bombing of Israel, the bombing of Iran, of the US, the bombing of his own nuclear facilities, and it's still there. So that's why they're claiming victories. They say, so we haven't disappeared, right? And my other suspicion is that if he was so effective on the nuclear facilities, I don't think the Iranians will want to end the war that easily and that fast. Probably the damage is contained, and learning that the Americans and the Israelis will stop here, they said, well, that's not too bad as a result of 12 days of intense bombing from two of the most powerful armies in the world. We survived. The nuclear facilities are broadly intact. So, to be honest, not even such a bad result. While in the process, receiving solidarity from the historical enemies, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Saudi Arabia issued a statement very clear. They didn't, use euphemism. They said the invasion of national sovereignty by the United States bombing Iranian nuclear site. It was not veiled. It was like, described as it is. And so this is a big step. Both are BRICS plus countries, so under the umbrella of China to some extent. So the situation is not as black and white as somebody believes in Washington, and I think it's still in flux. But I don't see the regime, while crippling, while massively weakened, being changed anytime soon.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as you point out in the views letter, there are numerous examples of wars that, are supposed to be concluded in days, but took years, from Hitler's Blitzkriegs to Putin's operation in Ukraine. And so certainly this war seems to have, drawn to a ceasefire for now, but we know about the history of the Middle East and the history of, how whether or not these ceasefires last. So it's certainly something that we'll continue to monitor for the weeks to come. As always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Till next time.